So let me welcome you. Good afternoon. Thank you for coming to the Humanities Decanted series. This is our informal showcase, the IHC's informal showcase for faculty members to present and discuss their newest research and creative work. I'm Susan Derwin. I'm the director of the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center, and the inventor of Humanities Decanted, which was all about figuring out how to draw the decanter in our icon or our image. So that was very important to us, and I'm glad to say it's still going. Before we do begin, I would like to acknowledge the Chumash people, who are the traditional custodians of the land upon which the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center is located, and I would like to pay respect to elders, both past and present. And I am so happy to welcome architect and Professor Swati Chattopadhyay, who is a faculty member in the history of art and architecture. She teaches and researches modern architecture and urbanism and the cultural landscape of the British Empire. She is the author of Unlearning the City, Infrastructure in a New Optical Field, and also Representing Calcutta, Modernity, Nationalism, and the Colonial Uncanny. And she's also the co-editor of the Routledge Companion to Critical Approaches to Contemporary Architecture of Architecture and of City Halls and Civic Materialism Towards a Global History of Urban Public Space. Today, though, she's here to speak to us about her newest book, Small Spaces, Recasting the Architecture of Empire. And Swati will be in conversation with Professor Cristina Venegas of the Film and Media Studies Department and a veteran Humanities Decanted interlocutor, I am happy to say. You are experienced, you're practiced, you're seasoned. Her publications include Digital Dilemmas, The State, the Individual, and Digital Culture in Cuba, and the co-edited Digital Activism, Community Media, and Sustainable Communication in Latin America. So, this is what will happen. Swati will begin with a short presentation, and then she and Cristina will speak with each other for about 30 minutes. And after they wrap up their conversation, we're going to open up the discussion to you, our audience members, so that you can ask questions and share your thoughts. So write down your questions and thoughts as you're listening. And as I said, continue to enjoy the snacks during the event. And let's get going with Swati's presentation. Welcome, Swati.
Thank you, Susan. It's always a pleasure. And nice to see all of you. I am supposed to unmute, and okay, I can do this. Pick mute. Right, okay. So I'm going to speak about 5 to 7 minutes. I even brought my phone, so I don't, I tend to speak too much. So what I wanted to share with you is how I kind of got into this project. I've been working on this for for 3 decades, but I didn't even know it was a book. Because I started, looking at literally small spaces that nobody looks at because they're not architecturally distinguished. I'm an architectural historian, an urban historian. We tend to look at things which are kind of prominent, big. They have some kind of weight. These are like obscure spaces that nobody really cares about. And this book literally was written in the margins of other research projects. Not a single research grant went into it. Okay. So, because I never thought of it like, this is my research project. So it was assembled from little bits of information, little bits of images here and there. Because I don't think if you start off by saying, I'm going to work on small spaces, you can actually have a research project. It has to be necessarily kind of assembled, and that's the task of assembly that I took on. My entree was this term I encountered. Imagine this, I'm in the British Library, looking into these, very dull archival material, like government reports, and bottle khana. I have no idea what that means. I think I know, multiple Indian languages. I should figure this out. But bottle means, bottle. Khana is a, suffix which refers to room, space, like gym khana. These are sort of Anglo-Indian terms that came out of the process of, colonial culture. But there are also the Thai Khana, etc., in Urdu, Hindu. There are lots of other terms. So then I started, once you figure out, this is a new term, then you start encountering it everywhere. Then I'm like, okay, they're in architectural plans, they're in real estate ads, they're literally everywhere. Then they're like, okay, so space for keeping bottles? That's what it is, really, okay? But that led me to think about, and this is how the reason why the space for keeping bottles became important in the 18th century is a massive amount of liquor that was being shipped from Europe to India and the Indian subcontinent, really into all of Asia. And then, of course, came food stuff, all the bottle stuff, et cetera, before things became canned, and then, of course, the canned goods. So actually, bottle counters expanded across the 19th century. They also moved from their peripheral locations in the house to a central location. And I'm like, seriously? So what's space about bottles? And that took me to trade links and looking at, this is the stuff that, sort of scholars of empire look at. Big things, trade links, etc. But they're usually about like opium, tea, big commodities that have big profit margins and so on and so forth. They are, it's indigo. They're never about, you would be surprised how little is written about alcohol, trade to India. It's like shocking. There's also almost nothing written about foodstuffs being, shipped from one location to another. So that gave me an access to, okay, so this is actually, this kind of insignificant space is really related to larger issues which is very much about empire as we understand it. But it also took me to other spaces, which are go down, which is a, term it's very, Anglo-Indian term, and this is actually across all of Asia. It's a very common storage space, a warehouse, that's what it is. But it can be small. Bottle khanas can be like 8 by 10 feet, okay? Could be larger. Then they are truly architecturally, not distinguished. But when you think about warehouses, you can think about, those are Manchester warehouses, big buildings, a lot of architectural attention went into it. Some of them, whether it's in Canton or Calcutta, actually, there was significant attention to their architectural sort of delineation. In other words, they were important spaces. In other words, when I'm talking about small spaces, I'm talking about marginal spaces or marginalized spaces, rather than always dimensionally small. Some spaces are actually dimensionally small. Some are not. Warehouses are like entire building blocks. That's what we are talking about. So that took me, but there was only one image of the bottle khana that I could find. And this is actually a caricature where this European woman, British woman, is sitting inspecting foodstuffs surrounded by servants, and there's a shelf with bottled goods. That's the bottle khana. So I, of course, the architectural historian in me, started tracking, where is the bottle khana? How is it moving? And I started looking at these processes. At the same time, something I've been working on, with my other aspects of my research, started looking at other kinds of quote-unquote small spaces that there's no historiography of verandas. There's no historiography of these spaces, despite the fact that, yes, they could belong to the Tagore family. And, you can't really get more important in Bengalidom than the Tagore family, okay? But there is practically nothing written about it. And that took me to other spaces like, verandas, terraces, courtyards, backstairs. These are what I would call a lexicon that is global. But really, there is no architectural history of it, or any kind of history. Then I started looking at what I would call spaces that you cannot inhabit, like live within, but around which you construct social relations. So I started looking at bookshelves, and I can tell you lots of stories about bookshelves, and boxes, boxes that are used whether to pack clothes, or pack food, or pack any kinds of thing. It could be writing equipment. And there was specialized, sort of designation for these boxes that were moved from one part of the world to another. Potted plants, big 19th century production. And then my favorite, at homeopathic medicine chest. You have to be an Indian to figure out why that would matter to anyone in the world. It is terribly important because these kind of spaces lead me to not only the world of servants, and indentured labor, but also to women of all classes, because this was important to them. It was very much about in domestic idiom, but I was interested in thinking about how is that domestic idiom connected to these larger sort of spheres of empire. We are told empires are big affairs. They're about huge territorial agglomerations. And this is kind of a map. This is an Imperial Federation map. of the late 19th century. So the person who's doing this, Sparkins, is an ardent imperialist. So he wanted to show how telegraphic connections, all kinds of connections, trade connections hold together empire. And my work actually tries to undo this assumption of empire as a territorial entity already kind of spoken for. Already you know what the territorial entity is. So what I started doing, and this is my I thought of myself, what is my summary of my book? So these are the I would say, what I can think of as what happens when you look at small spaces. What happens when you don't begin with the big scale and start with the small spaces? You change something fundamentally about how you begin to notice other processes, which, starting with the big scale, doesn't come into your visual field. So I'm changing the idiom of how we think about empire as, products of large processes, or big processes, big profit. They're all of that, but they're also about the very basic infrastructure of servants, enslaved labor, indentured labor, women, and all kinds of marginalized folks who really do not have a history in this empire, whatever that empire might be. So this is partly my trying to figure out how do you tell a spatial story of empire, and what do you gain by beginning with small spaces, whether they're dimensionally small or not. I am happy to speak about these more, during part of the conversation, but I think I'll stop here and let Cristina take over.
So this is an astonishing project. Might I just start with that? And so it doesn't surprise me that you've been working on it for a long time. But it is astonishing not only in its insight, and I feel like I have learned an enormous amount in reading this book, but also in the way in which it allowed me to create important associations to other spaces and other relations of other empires, and perhaps ask different questions about those things. And I think when you first told me about this project, I don't know when it was.
2 summers ago we were talking about it.
2 summers ago, yeah. And the first thing I thought of was how it reminded me of the spaces, the service spaces in my grandmother's house in northern Colombia, in this kind of airy, open, tropical style, modest house. And though you recognize all those spaces as service spaces, and there were just a few of them, it wasn't, this proliferation, but and though you understand those relations for what they are, the way that you talk about these spaces and their connection to other circulations of commodities and imaginations and peoples and economies was truly enlightening. And so I know we had a lot of fun talking about that. But it really resonated with me to think about this in a place that had nothing to do with British-Indian relations and the British Empire, though their British Empire did kind of proliferate in other ways. And so maybe because there's so many other questions I want to ask, I do want to ask you to say what constitutes small spaces. And maybe it's one place to start for all the other questions I have.
I think this is sufficient, right?
Yeah.
So small spaces, as I mentioned, they are spaces that are, you can think of them as dimensionally small. They are truly, they are kind of hidden spaces. And they could be, and I bring up a comparison with what's happening in colonial North America. They could be hidey holes. We have no history of hidey holes, where enslaved labor hit their United States, the products of their labor, because they would be forcibly parted with it. And they're places to hide, right? So those are also small spaces, talk of dimensionally small. So what I thought of, let's speak in terms of architectural history. When architectural historians look at spaces and look at spatial analysis, there is a rich body of works and method of how you look at what we call the major spaces in any building. There's no shortage of that. But it always begins with, let's say in a colonial American house. You start with the parlor, you start with the hall, and so on and so forth. Because this is the front of the house. Okay? There is a literature on what's literally called the back of the house, but it is still peripheral. My argument is that what happens if I don't start with the parlor? I don't start with the hall. I don't start with the front entry. Who entered the through the front entry, right? In other words, you're already thinking about space the way it's experienced. It is differentiated. Depends on who is where, who is experiencing it. There's no universal understanding of space. And this is a big problem of all architectural history. There's always presumption that there's some kind of Archimedean point of view from which you experience space. Plans are shown as, oh, that's what a plan is, and you can understand social relations. No, you don't. Depends on who it is. Who is it that is observing? Who is supposed to inhabit a plan or a building? So those are some of what I would say, for me, in a disciplinary point of view, very fundamental questions I was asking about how do you do architectural history? So, like I said, some of these spaces are small dimensionally, others are definitely not. Verandas, the one I showed in the Tagore Mansion, it's actually a very large veranda. It's a neoclassical house. Okay? So you can bring in any of those. You can also think of, one of the things I think about small spaces is that sometimes they're linked. In other words, in agglomeration, they create larger entities. Sometimes they're not. And this is something that I had to negotiate. Like, how do you talk about spaces that are actually intentionally disconnected? Okay? So in other words, how do you read connections and, or disconnects? That means it's also social disconnect. And what kind of privileges and, deprivations do these, entail? So it's going back to the social, ultimately it's doing a social history of architecture. But for me, the usefulness of thinking about empire and small spaces is that empire, you ask any historian, they will agree it's about bigness. And that's the fundamental thing I want to check. I don't think it is. It is certainly built on an infrastructure of small spaces. And these are all service-based. There's no empire without labor. It's very simple. It's not complicated.
So one of the things related to this that's really fascinating is the question of the temporality of labor and how you get at that. And there are many examples of this, and there are many amazing examples of this, but maybe you can say more about the temporality issue that is invisible, right? It's made invisible, and yet you need to find it. You do that kind of work of unearthing it.
So, I can draw on several examples. One, for example, I'm teaching my architecture and environment class this quarter. So I'm teaching about comfort, thermal comfort, and trying to explain to the students that it's in the 19th century this idea of thermal comfort became a thing because white folks were in tropical areas thinking we need bodily comfort. We need to be comforted. We need special comfort. Black folks don't need those. I'm putting it very crudely, but that's basically the bottom line. And so certain techniques were created. Let's think about, we typically inhabit some kind of conditioned space, thermally conditioned space. So if you're in Calcutta, there would be fans, like electric fans. We have electric fans in many, it's common, right? Let's go to the 19th century. There are no electric fans because there's no electricity. So what did people do before the 19th century if they wanted to cool themselves? They picked up a fan and this is what they did, right? Or if you're really elite, princes and nobles, etc., somebody would stand next to you. Can you imagine the bother? Fanning you, right? So that's how it worked. Now that elite tradition became embedded in everyday aspect of keeping white bodies comfortable and cool. So what would happen is that some servant would actually be, fans would be suspended. Imagine this space, large, like a kind of a plank of wood with flounces will be moved. It will be tied with a rope through the wall. A servant, who you cannot see, will be sitting outside, moving it back and forth so you can be cooled. You can be kept in a comfortable state. So, and when is that happening? Well, it can happen all through the day, certainly at night. So think of the social relations that are being produced. It could be the servant could be sitting in the veranda, could be nowhere, just outside. So his comfort doesn't matter, right? And then, it's not, you can imagine elite houses like some kind of version of that. Then by the mid-19th century, this became a practice in barracks of the colonial service. I'm talking about ordinary soldiers who somehow were needed to be fanned. And then you're talking about barrack, like lots of beds, right? So a train of fans would be connected. And so you needed an army of, here you get coolies to pull that. These are seasonal labor. So these kinds of practices in between what is inside, what is outside, which are the bodies to be comforted, which do the labor, and it's actually a new kind of labor emerged. Coolies is not new to the mid-19th century, but a new kind of labor, and they had to be extremely strong. So minute calculations were made in terms of how many trains of pankhas, they call pankhas, could be pulled by so many coolies without breaking the frame, because you're talking about structural stuff, right? So there is a certain kind of daily temporality, but it's also seasonal temporality that is worked into it. The other example that I find when I'm not talking about servants is women doing labor, daily, everyday chores, household chores. There's no accounting of it, right? So how do you understand, and I'm looking at memoirs where somebody's, a writer, painter, Rani Chandra is remembering her mother doing ordinary, everyday chores. And she makes it what I call an aesthetic episode. She makes it this beautiful act of cutting vegetables. Because she sees it, that labor, as meaningful, productive. She kind of rules the household, but she's sort of sitting in a veranda, doing that labor. And neighbors are coming in, sitting there, having conversation, seeking counsel. So space is created around that. In other words, it's not the physical structure. It is the socio-spatial structure that produces that, I would call, small space. So there's also thinking about that kind of temporality. And then the temporality of the flood, which I love, unless you want me to.
I wanted to go there later.
Okay.
First, maybe because you started out with the Bottle Khana, and there's a succession of names, and the importance of nomenclature in the book is really interesting. And the names of things, which then leads you to talk about understanding the relations between things and why things are called certain things, and the service tasks and the spaces. So, and there are a lot of really interesting terms in the book. Bottle Khana is only one, but there are many others. Perhaps you can, I don't know.
I can talk about the cook room.
The cook room.
It's not the kitchen, it's the cook room. So okay, isn't the cook room the kitchen? No, because the lady of the household does not cook in it. She doesn't even go really to supervise it. It's outside the house. A cook does the cooking. It's actually, coming from the idea of bawarchi khana, the cook room, literal translation. But, think of this. It's not unusual in colonial houses anywhere to have the cook room, kitchen outside, because, all the smell and all the labor, the sound, you don't want it. Politeness, refutes those. Like, you don't want that too close to you. You can actually hear labor, right? So you don't want that close. Great. But what happens when, in other words, it is really a space that is, and these are male cooks, the entire, retinue is male. So a certain relationship develops between the European woman, who's supposed to be nominally supervising these people. They're not even close. So she has to go into their domain. Now think of what the power dynamics becomes then. So the idea is to now, could we bring that space inside the house, but at what cost? Then you're bringing a certain kind of, the kitchen coming inside is more controllable, and so entire paraphernalia of, arrangements, objects, gadgets have to be rethought. Spaces have to be rethought. And these are really ordinary examples, like, we think of kitchens like, kitchen is a kitchen, right? No, kitchen is not a kitchen. Kitchen is very historically specific, right? So there are, many spaces like that, and, I talk about the dawa, and what I was talking about is, Rani Chandra's mother cooking and cutting vegetables. The Bengali term for a veranda in front of a room is dawa. But dawa is actually conceptually kind of different from a veranda. Veranda is, they all have colonial roots. Dawa actually comes from Sanskrit, is darbat, so it has a particular etymology, you can trace it. But it is really about rural households. The dawa is sort of intimately tied to the idea of a rural, and this is a Bengali household. And there are architectural definitions of it, okay? So I take this idea of what is a veranda, what is a dawa, and then there are other kind of terms, like roag, and what difference does it make? That they are actually in different places. One is next to the street, one is next to the courtyard, dawa is, fronts a courtyard. What difference does it make? So I get into what I call the architectural geekiness, completely analyzing all of those relations, but I think bringing some of that in, nomenclature matters. Calling spaces secondary or dependency. In colonial America, they were called dependencies. That actually turns around, who is dependent on whom? The masters are dependent on the labor. They cannot do without it. So calling certain spaces dependencies is actually completely, the wrong way around. So rather than thinking of them as dependencies, why, if we think of them as the primary spaces, then you begin to see other relations emerging. So that's why nomenclature is very important.
Very, very important. And the veranda, now that you bring it up, is a huge discussion in the book for a variety of reasons. It's about land imagination. It's about vantage. It's about social space and public space. And then you bring in these stories of different verandas and different families, and Tagore's veranda. So the stories within stories of the spaces actually open up an entirely different way to think about the space too. And so Tagore, I want to know more about how these stories, Rani Chandra's, Tagore's, there's Edith's story, Edith Cuddles, and others. I mean, there are various stories that somehow converge on these spaces that both allow a different vantage point on both the colonial side and the Indian side. So
these are what I call the common spatial lexicon that cuts across. But one of the examples, so second part of the book, it's about land imaginations. So, think of this. You look at actually history, books on history that look at how do you do historical research. They would say you have to choose a high vantage, and that's where you look into. You kind of have a kind of a survey, you can survey a landscape. That's the way of producing history. My point is that what if you don't do that? Stand on a mountaintop and looking at a settlement and so on and so forth. What if you make the dawa or the veranda your vantage at looking at a landscape? What does it become? So shifting the vantage is critical. So, colonial bungalows, well, they had front and back verandas and probably side verandas as well, okay? Because they were rooms were surrounded by verandas as protective spaces. That's a kind of a talk of thermal barrier, thermal buffer. But Edith Cuttle did a great job. She wrote about her garden and her house and so on and so forth. She distinguished between the functions of the different verandas. And then she wrote about the back veranda, which is the east veranda, which is right next to her beautiful flower and vegetable garden, mind you, which are gorgeous descriptions. Her husband, a captain, this is in the cantonment in Lucknow. He goes on a hunt and brings back all his trophies, and then he turns them into. He's eviscerating them and doing taxidermy basically. And he wrote a book about taxidermy. So she describes in great detail how to take apart a bird in the proper way. How it has to be killed at the right moment. You have to notice the eyes, otherwise you can never get back the life feeling. And so her east veranda after the hunt is like a pool of blood. And she actually describes it, and he is here, mind you, the captain, who is, the European masculine guy, he is without a shirt working on that. So there's a very kind of, that's a particular kind of labor that is being signaled here. So it's very interesting to me to think about when masculine white labor, and he's a military dude, how that kicks in, and what the veranda becomes right next to her very precious violet. And she's nurturing this violet. So I try to understand what does it mean to inhabit these spaces and transform these spaces into this kind of change the idiom. I mean, who thought of doing taxiderming in an open veranda? You should ask, why is he doing taxidermy in an open veranda? Because he will not have to clean it. Somebody else will clean it, and from a veranda you can just wash it off. It's not in, whereas his suggestions of how to do taxidermy when he's talking to English boys, mind you, it is that it is always in closed spaces. And there's a very different, directions of how you take apart a bird, because guess what? You'll have to clean it up yourself. So there are, in other words, the veranda offered, Captain Cuttle, a certain kind of leverage, talk of spatial privilege, right? But it also, for me, taxidermy, why is he doing taxidermy? It's becoming a lamp in her, drawing room. But it's also being sent back home as gifts. So all these kind of bodies of animals moving from one part of the world to another, and taxidermy was tremendously important in the 19th century. And because the live things cannot be sent, but you have to condition them properly. So all these, talk of another way of thinking about empire. Bodies and dead bodies and live bodies moving, between places. So, and for me, starting with the veranda, I never thought I would write about taxidermy. Why would I write about taxidermy? Okay. But that told me that these are the spaces which become important for these kinds of activities of empire. So I connect the landscape, the shield, the hunting grounds, to the colonial and the military cantonment, and then to, these ordinary households in Britain, where these are being sent. So these are the connections. That's another way of thinking about connections, right?
And there's another incredible connection, I thought, that you made with the veranda as an anomalous space, right? And so veranda is an anomalous space, and anomalous political formations of the EIC, and then that connects to British rule and to philosophical reasoning. Do you remember that?
Yeah. So, okay, I love the fact that, when we write these books on British Empire, we have to cite Macaulay. So 1830s, Macaulay, who, the reason I speak English is because it was mandated that English would become the language of empire, and the British Empire in India. So you're moving Persian as court language and bringing in English as the language of administration. So he's trying to rationalize why English needs to be taught and why you should not actually support Arabic and Sanskrit, because those are dead languages. Those are actually filled with falsehood. That's why, because they are not good enough for science and rational thinking and so on and so forth. Oh, great. But he did say, then he's also thinking about, he's a guy in law, he's thinking of law, language, administration. So he's thinking as he recognizes that what the British Empire in India, and he's talking about the East India Company, is an anomaly. Why is it an anomaly? Because this is about despotism being, sort of fashioned in a parliament, the British Parliament. So he's trying to rationalize why it needs to be, it's a necessary despotism. And he says, well, the empire is the greatest anomaly. That's why this needs to be, because there is no other way we can deal with this, because the contradictions, the differences are so vast, historical and political, that it is a necessary anomaly. So all of us refer to, Macaulay's anomaly. Discuss, he basically spoke of empire as anomalous. So I'm thinking about, if empire is anomalous, how else is it anomalous? Why is it an anomaly? And how would the anomalies sort of negotiate it? And so I think of the veranda, which is, it's kind of fungible in the sense of it can take different iterations. It can change, it's sort of shape-shifting, both of use and it can be extended, it can be contained. It's easily manipulable, but it's an enduring spatial entity. Is that these are the sites where the anomalies of empire could be worked out. These are exemplary sites to think about how did the anomalies of empire between, we must teach them English, but we cannot consider them equals. In other words, the notorious, English in, what is it, taste and, what is it, I forget. White, white, not white, but not in, except in blood. It cannot be blood. In other words, of course, no intermixing, but it is English in thoughts and language, but not in blood, and not in terms of, in other words, racial distinctions need to be maintained, right? So you need intermediaries. That's why you want English to be taught, because you need intermediaries of, who are, yes, white, but not white, because you never can be white, right? So those kinds of, and I don't think those are contradictions at all. They're anomalies, and that's what the empire depended on, those kinds of anomalies. And it rode on anomalies. Okay? And they were constantly debated, negotiated, and upgraded, and so on and so forth. So for me, thinking about empire is that you think of the tavern stuck on another small space, right, of liquor and so on and so forth. Liquor makes very interesting, bedfellows, right? So then the British soldiers, and these are sailors, the subalterns, the classic subaltern, are sort of hobnobbing with Indian women in the bazaars. We have a problem, right? We have a major problem. So lots of laws are kicking in, sort of containing that soldier population, separating populations, and so on and so forth. Because bazaars are spaces of the greatest anomalies, because places of exchange. There you go. What are you going to do without bazaars? You have to have bazaars, right? So, it is actually, Macaulay was right. The empire is the greatest anomaly. And this is talking about the British Empire. So where are the sites of anomaly? So one of my chapters called Anomalous Spaces is about the verandas and the life of the verandas.
And the roofscapes. I love the roofscapes, especially in Tagore's house. And I'm not familiar with Tagore's house, but I would like to be familiar with Tagore's house, his story of the house, and then the grandfather's adjacent house, which then, becomes transformed. But he talks about the terrace as village life itself, and the landscape as a way of thinking about village life. And that really struck me, of thinking about the activities of what was going on, the social space, but just in terms of the expansiveness of that space.
So, terraces, rooftop terraces we're talking about, in all of, and I would say, make this huge generalization, all of India is kind of important. In some places where you have sloping roofs, you cannot inhabit the roof. But much of northern India, you have flat roofs. Actually, it doesn't really work very well with rainy, climates, but where Bengal is. But it was the fashionable way to build, because this is how the Mughals built. Okay, of course you're going to, And then comes the neoclassical Mediterranean vocabulary, and both of them come together. So you get a lot of flat roofs, and they were used for domestic chores, for leisure. And what is exemplary, again, about the Tagore one, because they wrote about those things. Okay, Tagore himself wrote about it. His memoirs, he wrote two. This is Rabindranath Tagore, writer-poet. He began with the looking at the urban scape of Calcutta in his childhood through the gaps in the balustrades of the terrace. His head couldn't quite reach above. And that's his world. And this is the only place he could find a little bit of freedom. So the way I understand it, the way he's introducing his, he's thinking, this is not the stuff of history. And, so in other words, I'm writing this because he wanted to talk about what I call the painfully prosaic, the painfully personal. That really, as a very elite, well-respected man by that time he's writing this, he's kind of at the height of his fame, he is kind of uncomfortable sort of delving into those really domestic, personal, sort of looking back upon his childhood. But he begins with the terrace. And the way I think about the reason he started with that is because he was trying to convey how he developed the habit of imagination, of thinking about people, places. He's registering sounds that are coming. There's a cow shed close by, so the sound of that. There's a hawker, sound of that. It's very cinematic, actually, beautifully cinematic. But he also then talks about the women of the household will go up there at different times, the servants and the women, and that's sort of the width of the village, because there was only one space, which is what we architecturally would say unprogrammed space. Every other space is programmed. There's a particular function to it. Terraces were unprogrammed space, so you could make it whatever you wanted, and it again gives to anomalies. But one of the things that happened, daily chores are happening, all the putting out pickles, etc., to dry, and there's entire conversations about that. You relax in the evening, but those were also the sites of these salons where music was played, where poetry was exchanged. And one of the very well-known literary magazines were actually founded there by one of his sisters-in-law. So those are also the very refined spaces of conversation. So because things can take on these, and they're also spaces of meditation if you want to. So all of this happening in just the flat roof terrace. And this is, if you want to just, describe it, well, what is it there? Later, when he was, much advanced in age, it actually became the setting of theaters. So it was large enough you could play a badminton game there. That's how large it was. But it was also space of actually staging, events. And it was not, in one sense, an anomaly. It was not exceptional. The same thing that happened in the other famous family of Calcutta, the Boses. That's Sharat Chandra Bose and Subhash Bose's, Sharat Chandra Bose's rooftop terrace where Mahatma Gandhi is there. He's staying there. So he's holding his morning meditations there, so there's always a crowd around him, right? And then everybody wants access to the space, and he's like, we can't give the entire city access to this space. And the claim that if Gandhi is there, it's public space. It's not a private space. So those kind of challenges that, that because it's kind of open space, it is unprogrammed, but you can do so many things in it. And so my strategy has been to pick on these spaces to craft a story about why these spaces are so well remembered. So I think that's how memories congeal in these spaces. They're kind of deposited. Why they become important.
Well, I won't be able to pronounce this right, but I'll try. Vidyasagar's library. Vidyasagar's library.
Yeah.
That is an extraordinary story that begins with a bookshelf, and then moving and the donation, I guess, of the bookshelf to the library, but to be kept exactly as it is, books exactly in the order that they are in. And so you begin by asking why and what is unique to this, and then you unpack histories of reading.
So I take these what I call the containers. That's the last part of the segment of the book. I honestly thought I'd write really short chapters, a short book. I wrote a much bigger book than I had planned. Okay, and I still tried to keep the chapters more or less short. But this one, so I work in one of the libraries in Calcutta, which has an excellent collection of Bengali works. It's a Bongi Sahitya Porishad library, and there's this very old, nice bookshelves, and they happen to belong to reformer, writer, luminary of the 19th century public sphere in Calcutta, Ishwar Chandra Vidyashagar. He's a Sanskrit Pandit, but he also wrote English beautifully. He learned it himself. Okay. And he created his library. He custom ordered all his bookshelves to all 26 of them. Imagine, mid-19th century, 26 bookshelves. He's ordering books from London, he's collecting locally, and he built a house to house his bookshelves. Actually, it's the letter he wrote to his dad. I want to build a house. He's trying to explain why he's building a house in a city and not in his rural village. So he's always asking for permission to build this city house, townhouse, because I want to devote my time to study. I want to spend my time in the library. So we have these kind of little bits of history. It's fascinating because I'm looking at his bookshelf and I'm going, it is Vidyasagar's bookshelf. That's pretty cool. And I'm a big Vidyasagar fan, just so you know. But it is talk of not particularly distinguished. It's a nice wooden 19th century bookshelf. That's what it is. It's not like, oh my God, I'm going to do a deep art historical reading of the bookshelf. I can't. It's just a bookshelf. Okay? That's what it is. So I started, of course, me, the architectural historian, looking at the house. The house exists. It's actually not been destroyed, which is extraordinary. And to figure out where they were. And they're actually great descriptions because people noticed his bookshelves, how he kind of surrounded himself with them, where he sat, how he read, how he greeted his friends and visitors. And then what happens, and this is, this is completely the weird 19th century Bengali thing. So he is so well known because, one of his big contributions is that he gave a big push. He did the major work for the Widow Remarriage Act so that Bengali Hindu widows could remarry. So he's this tremendously important figure. So he's like, these guys called people who are worshipped in their own lives, literally. And then comes the other character who is worshipped in his own life, is a saint, Ramakrishna Paramahamsa. Middle-class Bengalis, and Swati Chattopadhyay has written about it, took him to this guiding saint. He basically told them, who said you have to do colonial service? The only thing you really have to do is think of God. That's all you need to do. Colonial service is slavery. Or you think you are an educated person doing important stuff? It's all slavery. All you need to think is God. So he's very intrigued, this guy is very intrigued. Ramakrishna is very intrigued by this Vidyasagar person. You've never, because Vidyasagar, for all practical purposes, was an atheist. Not quite, but he practically was. He was a Brahmin, but he did not do any of the rituals, etc., that was expected of a upper caste Brahmin. Brahmin is upper caste. So he says, I want to meet him. So he's brought to the house, and there's a great description of him entering the house. It was what Brian Hatcher has described as bourgeois respectability. So Ramakrishna is a rural, not very well-educated man. He's very rustic. He's thinking, okay, this is too proper. I said, no, it's okay. It's not a problem. He's a very magnanimous guy. So he goes in, and there's a description of an encounter between the two in this library, where within about 15 minutes, the terms of conversation completely changed. Suddenly, the way it's described, of course, described by it's part of a Ramakrishna's hagiography, is described as almost. First, he notices his bookshelves. He's surrounded by this is high literacy, literate world, and he's not part of that. But he wants to have this conversation with somebody who's so important, so respected, so learned. Vidyasagar literally means ocean of learning. So he wants to sort of have a conversation, but once the conversation starts, literally the way it's described, the frame of the bookshelf sort of disappeared. Now the terms of engagement change. It becomes about just the two of them. And so I was very interested in reading how in the hagiography, the house is remembered, the bookshelves are remembered. There are those who went to him for literary discussion. They remember the bookshelves in a particular way, how much care with which they were organized and so on and so forth. But when he's talking about to Ramakrishna, suddenly all of those disappear. And Ramakrishna is doing the talking, and Vidyasagar is, very respectfully, answering very little, but always with humor. And, sort of the repartee is very interesting. So I was interested in how kind of almost like the space dematerialized, like something else happened there. Yeah. And I'm interested in those readings of those spaces. And there is, in between this, of course, bookshelf its proliferation of the 19th century brought about new kinds of spaces. So that's, my sort of discussion of that.
And I don't know how we're doing with time, but I do have more.
Probably just a couple more minutes. We're getting close to,
Okay, so maybe just to close, perhaps with an ephemeral space, which is part of Rani Chandra's story, which is actually in different chapters of the book, but just this description of the house when the flood comes and the transformation of the landscape, but the constant patching up the house as an everyday practice. That really struck, this, just that it is part of the constant everyday, ordinary, it becomes ordinary, and yet it is fundamental to maintaining that house when the flood comes. But that's part of her story that she's telling. And so it's another way in which these storytelling practices are part of the architectural history, which I found fascinating too. Yeah.
So I'm glad you picked up on Rani Chandra, that you remembered Rani Chandra's story. Okay. She's writing a story about her mother's father's house. That's literally what the title of the book is, My Mother's Father's House. Because that's where she found her mother fulfilled. Because in terms of her mother's husband's house, the river has taken it away. That's how we put it in Bengal. In other words, the rivers move. And they take away villages, houses, and so on and so forth. So that house is gone. So they didn't really have sort of a house on what Rani Chandra's dad thought would be his retirement home. Is taken away by the river. It's an ordinary occurrence. But you have to also understand, most of these houses are actually built with mud. And these are actually very wealthy families. Swati Chattopadhyay, you might have heard, novelist, literary scholar. These are all in what is now Bangladesh. It was East Bengal at the time. And it's a riverine region. So the only way to really build sensibly is with mud. Because the rivers will move and take away the house and property. So the house she's describing is, again, it's a wealthy family actually, but the house is, it's earth construction. What that means is that floods are seasonal. It floods, the house remains flooded for 3 months. So she gets a beautiful description of how the water is coming, and all the village is very excited. Oh, the water's coming, water's coming. It's almost like it's a festive thing. And it's coming through the river, the canal, etc., and all the ponds become one, all the stretches of water becoming one, and then it enters the courtyard. So you have to imagine this. Enters the courtyard, and it's rising, ankle deep, it's rising, and these dawa, where, the veranda where her mother sits in, it's very high. It would be about, at least this much high, okay, if not higher, because you expect flood. Okay? So it is coming, and it would always stop just at the threshold. But before that, the house, the bottom has been, it's with earth construction, you have to maintain it regularly. You have to do the repair. But a particular kind of repair has been done so that the standing water for 3, months is not a problem. But before that, a bamboo, this is a courtyard house with rooms and different around the courtyard, different sides of the courtyard. A bamboo bridge has already been built, so you don't have to step into the water. So you can convey things and people across that. And so she describes that, but the other thing that when the water goes down, it goes down fast and leaves all this, dirt, etc. But in between, when the water is kind of, as I said, white water becomes clear. White water is rushing water, but it becomes clear. And then you can fish there. You can do whatever, because all water is one. River water, pond water, courtyard water is one. And it stays there for 3 months. And what she talks about is when the water goes down, is going down. So you have to think about the temporality of those. It's actually great because in rural areas where the road infrastructure is really bad, this enables people to communicate by boat everywhere, right? Suddenly, that's really a better way of moving. But when the water is receding, when water recedes, it really goes fast. And so somebody notices, rice fields, this is rice country. Rice fields are moving a bit because the saplings have not quite grabbed the earth, they have become loose, and one field is moving up. Entire fields are moving away with the rushing water, receding water, which means one field will take away another field, will take away another field. So you have to hem them in. So you have to get everybody together to put the, sort of the posts in there so fields stay in one place. So this is, I'm talking about a mobile land. So you have to think about what kinds of durational parameters we use when we think about spaces and architectural histories. So one of the things I love about these, the examples I picked of these memoirs, is that they're extremely attentive to temporal changes, daily, seasonal, and when I have to say, and I grew up in Calcutta, and in Bengal, I've seen terrible floods, but to learn how to live with the flood is something quite different. And there was no sense anywhere in that book that floods were devastation. No, they knew how to build in flood, live with flood. And it came to me as a surprise that you could do that. Because for me, water staying in a courtyard for 3 months would be a calamity. No, not if you are attuned to certain, environmental issues. It's not.
Yeah. Okay, I'll stop there and open it up for questions. I'm sure there are questions.
So if you have questions, raise your hand, we'll bring a microphone to you. Don't be shy.
Thank you so much. Just very, very rich conversation. And while you were explaining it, I was wondering if you had a thought about photography in relationship through this kind of an investigation, in part because the framing of the photograph itself makes visible small spaces and heightens them in a certain kind of way, but also as an instrument of memory and the production of memory, and even perhaps as an historiographical tool for the kind of work that you're doing. Is there some resonance there that might be applicable to what we're talking about? And I'll just say, while you think about it for a moment, one of the things that came to my mind almost immediately was the Farm Security Administration's photographs from the 1930s going into the homes of people who are dispossessed in certain kinds of ways, but isolating particular parts of the house, which almost become sacred spaces by virtue of the way attention is given to them. So as a way of seeing and a way of thinking about these sites, is photography of use or value?
It's a very good question. And I have to say, I intentionally stayed away from photography as photographs per se. I've used some photographs, but in conjunction with architectural, analysis and plans and so on and so forth. And there was one time I thought of whether I should use it or not, because you have to think about what is photography mostly I'm looking at the 19th century, early 20th century. What is photography in the 19th century? Who is doing the photographs? It's almost always going to be the dominant perspective. And there's not a single photograph, and I really know the British Library's collection of photographs, for example, of these small spaces inside. Bottle Khana is only one image I could find from the entire archive. So there are actually caricatures but depictions of the cookrooms and so on and so forth. The reason I was thinking about, there's one time I thought of whether to use it or not, and then decided no. And I was looking at it, connecting, in one chapter I connect the cookroom in Madras, President Chennai, to the Madras famine. So that's one of the connections I'm looking at. How do you start with the cookroom and then make connections to this larger, I was looking at one cookbook that this military officer wrote. It's all about, fancy food, it's gourmet cooking and so on and so forth. And I noticed it was produced during the Madras famine. So it allowed me to connect the humble cookroom, and he had lots to say about how cooks need to be changed and surveilled and so on and so forth, how bodies need to be, control. This is basically what I call the language of command, right? Using sort of you need to command their space, the labor spaces. And there are some photographs of the Madras famine of showing emaciated people. And so I used a lot of the archival material of the famine, including maps, plans of famine camps. So I'm looking at, that to me is a small space, not dimensionally small at all. But it is quite, to put it very nicely, troubling of how they were photographed. There's one photographer who used these people, and they were made to stand, they can barely stand, against a neoclassical architectural edifice. And I had to make sense of how do I think with this. And I chose not to reproduce what I thought was an extremely violent photographic intervention. And he did write that there was one group of people he thought he would photograph, and the lighting conditions were not good. Next day, they were dead. This is what I'm talking about. Mind you, famine camps are predecessors of concentration camps, right? So I decided to actually stay away from photographs because the buildings I look at, for example, Edith Cuttle's, there's actually a photograph of her bungalow and so on and so forth. It's very interesting to see how they're photographed. There's a bungalow. You can imagine what the bungalow would look like. And there are all these servants in front. I'd use that. There's a photograph of this one head servant. I use that. But I'm thinking about, not so much why these were taken or who took it. There's no photographer's name. But how they were used to tell a story, how they were interspersed within her memoirs in particular. So that's something I look at. But I've also, talking of, I looked at another European woman in a plantation, and there were photographs. This is Iris McFarlane. His son, Alan McFarlane, is an anthropologist at Cambridge, and he was very generous with sharing the archive. But I prefer to use the drawings that the children, when Alan was small, they did, and she did. I think, to me, those were more revealing about the spaces, at least the story I wanted to tell.
Is there a photograph of the calorie meter?
Yeah. I use that.
So you talk about the food access, and in talking about the food access, we end up talking about the famine.
Yeah.
And the calorie as
the calorie meter. It's not a meter; it's a room, chock of small spaces, and it was done at Wesleyan, the university. So they're trying to figure out. This is the U.S. invention of calorie as a measure of how you think about food as energy, so how you can make food universal, and the completely pseudoscientific understanding of how food. You basically put a person in there. In a room which is hermetically sealed, and you are giving them certain kinds of food and asking them to do certain kinds of exercises, and then you're measuring their input or output, how much air, etc. Can you imagine? Talk of, the nice way of putting it, the noise of that data, okay? Can you imagine what the noise of the data is? So those kinds of experiments, and of course also open field experiments with sharecroppers in Alabama were done, and directly linked calorie, food habits, and housing were directly connected. So I use, there is actually documentation of those, actually several images of those spaces that were called calorimeters. Okay. And I get into, Nick Cullither a historian, has done a wonderful job talking about the foreign policy of the calorie, how US invented calorie as this measurable unit, and how it was used in the First World War as food aid. So our historian colleagues have done a wonderful job of looking at how brutal food aid is in the name of aid. When you think of calories in universal measure, so I don't know how much time we have, but Mike Davis, whose work I love, Mike Davis wrote Great Victorian Holocausts. Good book, not his best work, great book. But there he's talking about the Madras famine, and he actually did a chart. So how much food was given to these people, And then he compares it with, other measures, including concentration camp with Buchenwald. He says, Madras famine was even less than that. And I'm going, not Mike Davis. He's taking that idea of universal measure as a valid way of thinking about food. So we have bought this, the idea of calorie. Every little package has so many calories, right? Lock, stock, and barrel without even thinking about what that means in terms of, it was about measuring labor. It is about understanding how we can make labor efficient. That's where calorie comes in, right? So how that has become, of all people, like, who can we think of a critical Marxist geographer like Mike Davis? He uses it as a valid interpretive tool for comparing sites of devastation. I find that deeply problematic. So I use the calorimeter as a way of thinking between the cookroom, and one of the arguments I'm also making is that, before the calorie was invented in the 1890s, there was already that kind of rationing of food was happening in prisons, in army camps, prison camps, POW camps, and these famine camps. Trying to think about how little food you have to give a person when they can do hard labor and not die. So like the limit point, okay? So very careful, calculations were made. So I use those kinds of understanding of, this is talking about labor, this sort of hard physical labor, and what does it mean for these people to actually build the infrastructure of empire? They're building canals, they're building railways. And the engineers are telling these people who are doing these things like, emaciated labor doesn't make good labor. But you cannot give food unless people do hard labor. So I'm connecting different points here in terms of the US obsession with calorie and using calorie as a universal measure. One argument I'm making is that you can think about empire as a vast calorie transfer. And I'm building on other people who have thought about like what happened in the Madras famine. Why was there, shortage of, grain? Because lest England starve, right? Same thing with, what happened during the Second World War. It about, the war efforts needed food supplies rather than so on and so forth. But, that we can talk about those endlessly. But the point is that you can't think about empire as a massive calorie transfer, one set of population to another. But you can also question that and say, once I say that, I am buying into a certain kind of universalizing of food or spatializing food. And that I find, so I'm very critical about how I'm also deploying that, but I use the calorimeter as the small space in between the cookroom and the famine camp to understand global relations.
How do you become a small space?
Yeah.
As impulse, your methodology puts me in mind of where in the U.S. social history and public history meet. So once upon a time, I was a national park ranger. I had the hat and everything. And I most enjoyed spending time in the cookroom, the slave quarters, and the back stairs, and would take the opportunity to interpret in various ways labor, what it felt like to, walk a chamber pot up the steeper stairs as opposed to the stairs that had a landing. And I'm just wondering if there's an analog or a resonance between those methodologies and at least the impulse of your methodology where these small spaces intersect with, social history, labor history, feminist history, African-American history, or,
Very much.
Histories of slavery.
I'm intellectually raised by Americanists, so that's my foundation, and though I work on, British Empire and mostly in the Indian subcontinent. And I honed my skills of thinking about small spaces actually by looking at American colonial history and colonial spaces. Jim Dietz's book, In Small Things Forgotten, is my complete Bible. And he was my teacher. But there's a very good article by one of our dear friends and colleagues, Rebecca Ginsburg, who wrote about the slave landscape and what a landscape like a plantation looks like from the enslaved's point of view. And how do you see pathways? How do you interpret that landscape? And sometimes it's shocking to me how, that was published like 10 years ago, something like that. So before that, we have very good histories of those spaces, but nobody has actually thought of the different subject positions of how different people perceived those spaces. And one of the examples I can think of is, and I include that in the book, is actually Monticello, Jefferson's Monticello. And the way the basement was the, sort of the staging space for the food to be taken up, and the dumbwaiters and all those interventions. And De Lupton has a very good analysis of that. So I sort of take that, and the way I think about it is that way of how colonial spaces in colonial America were linked, conjoined, and separated. Okay? And what are the resonances with what's happening in British India? There's a lot. There's almost replication of practices, and you have to think about, why are these practices so similar? Why are these so-called dependencies? Why are these back houses? Okay, why is the punkah? Punkah comes to colonial North America from India. Okay, so the punkhas were used. Okay, so I actually showed my students an image of enslaved, doing the punkah. Okay, and because technologies, ideas moved. So in terms of interpretive lens, I have to think about, I pay a lot of attention to labor history. There's very good labor history of empire, British Empire. And when I was particularly looking at coolies, when did the idea of coolies emerge in India? And why are these, so punkah coolies, so I'm obsessed with, thermal comfort and punkahs, as you probably figured. It's like, where did this emerge? Where did this, labor form come from? Okay. And sort of, because there's actually very good labor histories of British colonial India, I was able to actually track back some different lineages of that and how that could inform my spatial analysis. In a way that I don't think architectural historians, and this is very good histories of colonial America, have not quite done. In other words, bringing labor history together with architectural history, that's an unfinished project, let me put it this way.
Hi, thank you for this fascinating talk. My question is, as much as it congeals the spaces, the small spaces that you describe congeals like larger imperial social relations, how far have you found the same spaces also congealing internal social relations like caste hierarchies, and how does that, I'm sure it plays into your labor argument as well, and just if you could talk a little bit about that, thank you.
So I actually used backstairs to think about how racial relations and caste relations perfectly were overlapped and made like seamless in terms of how bathrooms were serviced. So I actually spent a lot of time on it because those of us who actually grew up in colonial houses know those backstairs very well. They still exist. And they're called sweeper, the janitor, who would clean, the only servant who would not go through the house would be the one who cleaned the bathroom. So separate, and these were all, cast iron staircases, circular staircases, sort of adjunct spaces. So I talk about that. Backstairs is very important, actually. And I can think of one house I lived in where that system was prevalent, and thinking about it's like, oh wow, caste relations, racial relations were a perfect overlap, and congealed for me, the backstairs is, explains it more than anything else. Because of course, most of the 19th century, there's no indoor plumbing, right? So, they have to be cleaned, as they were called, night soil, had to be removed. And one of the few servants who needed to be there 24 hours a day was the sweeper, because after every use, bathroom had to be cleaned. And so there's a lot of discussion about that. So for me, I don't know, that holds up the infrastructure of empire. Okay. Thank you.